Thank you. I think we should all remember that November has been designated National American Indian Heritage Month, and therefore, we, the members of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco, acknowledge that we are located on the ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples who inhabited what is now the San Francisco Peninsula. The Greater Bay Area is also the ancestral territory of the Miwok, Yokuts, Patwin, and other Ohlone tribes. Indigenous communities have lived and moved through this area, anthropologists say, for more than 10,000 years. We further recognize that as the original stewards of this land, the Ohlone understood the interconnectedness of all things and maintained harmony with all of nature for millennia. We honor them for their enduring commitment to our Mother Earth. In our role as guests in this area at this time, we recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging these Indigenous occupants and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. Please join us in a minute of silence to acknowledge and honor these ancestors. Thank you. And now I'm pleased to welcome Michael Eisenscher, our speaker for today. Michael is the National Coordinator Emeritus in the U.S. Labor Against the War and has authored many articles on the intersection of labor, militarism, and the environment. He continues to serve as a delegate to the Alameda Labor Council from the Peralta Federation of Labor and co-founded its Climate and Environmental Justice Caucus. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure. And greetings, everybody. I use the pronouns he, him. Just put that on the record. Let me tell you first, before I begin, a little bit about how I came to this subject. I have spent my entire adult life in the labor movement and other social justice struggles, beginning with actually the civil rights movement in the 60s. And then in the latter part of my life, I became the national coordinator of U.S. Labor Against the War. So I brought the labor and the anti-war element, anti-militarism element together. And while I was an organizer in the Silicon Valley back in the 80s, I was part of the beginning of the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, which brought me into the environmental movement. So that's kind of where I'm coming from in terms of how I got to think about what's the connection between these. Before I start, I want to begin by giving credit to Nick Rabb from Massachusetts Peace Action. He did an excellent two-part webinar on this topic last month. I've shamelessly borrowed some of his slides and integrated them into this presentation, and I want to give him credit for that. So let's get into it. Let me start the screen share here. Can everybody see that screen?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes? Okay, good.
I know we should name ourselves.
Now, let me just pull this down here. Okay. I think we're ready to go. Thought I was ready to go. Hang on just a minute. There we go. So I want to talk about intersectionality. It's a concept that's popular now to represent how we understand the overlapping influences of various crises and the movements that they generate in response. This is what they call a Venn diagram, and you may have learned that in school or elsewhere. It represents the intersectionality between anti-militarism, ecology, ethnicity, class, race, and gender. Another descriptor is sometimes used called overdetermination, that these crises don't simply overlap, they interact. This is a cartoon I came across a number of years ago during the Iraq War, and I enjoy sharing it because it contains a kind of fundamental truth. I'll read it to you. It might be harder to read on screen. Uncle Sam complains, I spend all my money on wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Libya. I have no money left for schools, libraries, hospitals at home. My Pentagon budget is growing exponentially year after year, while I lay off teachers and firefighters for lack of funds. What's wrong with me, Doc? And the therapist responds, you suffer from a deep-seated military-industrial complex. Let's examine that patient ourselves. This diagram illustrates the fact that the climate crisis spawns a number of interrelated crises: migration, species loss, hunger, loss of earnings, social unrest, and protests, which are consequences of extreme weather, ecological destruction, and resource scarcity, as well as others. The climate crisis is a consequence of toxic pollution and emission of greenhouse gases, exploitation of natural resources, misuse of land, and destructive political priorities and choices. It's complex, and it turns out most all of these aspects are touched by the military. War is an environmental nightmare, both in its conduct and its consequences. The US military is the largest consumer of fossil fuels and the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet. In 2017, for example, the military emitted 59 million metric tons of greenhouse gas. If it were a country, its toxic emissions would rank larger than 170 other countries, making it the 25th largest polluter in the world. And since this report is several years old, everything in it has gotten measurably worse since then. Military emissions are not even included in the data that is collected and reported by the US to the international community. And that's an important point. Being such a large emitter, its emissions are not even factored into the US responsibility for the crisis. Our military maintains more than 800 identified bases around the world in more than 90 countries. This does not include the so-called black sites operated by special forces and intelligence agencies. If you combined all of the 40,000 domestic military bases together, it would create a landmass larger than the entire state of Florida. The US military is figuratively and literally toxic to the welfare of the American people and the world. David Vine, whose research revealed this information, observes, and I quote, By definition, most bases store large quantities of weapons, explosives, and other inherently dangerous tools of war. Nearly all of them contain toxic chemicals and other hazardous waste, generating pollution, contamination, and other environmental harm. 70% of military emissions come from the consumption of jet fuel. One B-52 bomber consumes about as much fuel in an hour as the average car driver uses in 7 years. Since 9/11, the US has spent more than $21 trillion on militarization, surveillance, and domestic and foreign repression, all in the name of national security, with bipartisan support from some of the same politicians who rail against the fully funded Build Back Better bill. The National Priorities Project tracks this spending. On their website, you will find these counters that show the spending for each of these categories. And that's for the entire global war on terror. Their website is nationalpriorities.org. The US spends more than the next 11 countries combined, more than Russia and China, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela all together. This year, the government will devote 55% of its resources, its discretionary spending, to national security, which is more than $741 billion, while devoting only $9.2 billion to EPA, which is charged with dealing with the causes and consequences of climate change. If you add interest paid on war debts, national security spending in other departments of the government like energy is where the nuclear war weapons are housed, state and homeland security together, they consume 2/3 of our discretionary budget. Our government squandered $6.4 trillion on wars in just the last 2 decades. The cost of shifting our power grid to 100% renewable energy over the next decade is projected to be $4.55 trillion. If we had spent this money on our grid, we wouldn't be facing the environmental crisis that we face today. We're entitled to ask, which better protects our national security? Military spending or spending on the environment? We can see how the climate crisis affects society and how people respond to the crisis. The reaction of our government to social unrest and protest is that we get militarized borders, xenophobia, racism, poisoned propaganda, suppression of dissent, and increasingly an authoritarian concentration of political and economic power. Our military spends $81 billion a year just protecting the oil supplies of our government. Getting a little behind here. One consequence of the climate crisis and US wars and other military operations around the world is forced migration of impacted populations. Forced migration is a consequence of hunger, poverty, conflict, and climate changing global heating. Forced migration is projected to affect 200 million people by mid-century, making the current border crises around the world pale by comparison. One price paid for fossil fuel extraction and consumption is wars fought to secure, protect, and control fossil fuels. And as I indicated, we spend $81 billion each year on protecting big oil. That comes to about 28 cents a gallon on every gallon of gas consumed in the United States. It's essentially a hidden war tax that we pay at the pump. The fossil fuel industry relies on state violence to uphold its operations around the world. In effect, the US military is big oil's enforcer, enabling it to extract, transport, and sell fossil fuels around the world. Many of you may be familiar with the observation of General Smedley Butler in 1933, who said, "War is a racket conducted for the benefit of the few at the expense of the masses. I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism." But the consequences of US militarism is not just felt by people abroad. Militarism has a domestic manifestation that we see, for example, in the militarization of the police response to social protest in the struggles to block construction of Line 3 and the Dakota Access Pipeline. Enbridge Corporation paid the police to arrest, brutalize, and torture water protectors on Line 3. In total, the company reimbursed the police department $2.4 million for their services, essentially as a private security force. And in the streets of the American cities, the roots of modern police can be traced to slave patrols organized to recapture runaway slaves, union-busting gun thugs deployed against workers seeking to organize and strike, and vigilante gangs that terrorized immigrant communities. All of this in the service or maximizing corporate profits and increasing state control of society. The climate crisis cannot be separated from issues of justice and power. Militarism and climate are two facets of the same crisis. Inequalities in society will become exacerbated as militarized powers will exert force to gain access to resources. The battle over resources intensifies social and economic inequality. Whoop, let me go back to that one. The Poor People's Campaign created a moral budget that showed that fair taxes on the wealthy, corporations, and Wall Street could yield $866 billion annually. Ending direct and indirect subsidies to coal, oil, and gas would yield another $649 billion each year. And redirecting $350 billion a year from the military to meet social needs could be accomplished without affecting national security. Together, that's more than what Congress just spent on infrastructure. Just 11% of the Pentagon budget could power every one of the 128 million households with solar and wind energy. 1% could fund 125,000 infrastructure jobs. 25 billion currently spent on immigration and border enforcement could fund 337,000 clean energy jobs. In a democratic society, governments should reflect and respond to the will of the people. The Green New Deal proposed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Progressive Caucus in Congress is supported by the majority of the American people of all political persuasions, including Republicans. Before he left office, Dwight Eisenhower warned us about the danger of the conjunction of the military establishment and arms industry, which he called the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex involves more than just the Pentagon and government contractors. It includes intelligence services, Homeland Security, the State Department, PR and media firms, think tanks, lobbyists, and even our universities. The military-industrial complex sees climate change as both a threat multiplier, but also a profit opportunity, an opportunity to strengthen its grip on our politics, social relations, and culture. It should be clear by now that we can't shoot our way out of the climate crisis. Climate change will be used by the military-industrial complex and corporate-owned members of Congress to justify even more militarism, manufacturing threats, and playing on our fears. Netta Crawford, a professor at Boston University, observed, climate change can lead to conflict and war, but war, we know, also promotes climate change. So we can't fight climate change as a threat with more and more military spending, which will lead to just more and more greenhouse gas emissions from the military. We need a new definition of national security, one that includes the right to a stable job at living wages, healthcare as a right, not a commodity, quality education without regard to income and without condemning students to a lifetime of debt, a dignified and secure retirement, and an ecologically sustainable planet. What's required to achieve a just transition to a sustainable peace economy? We must fully fund social programs and the social safety net. We have to invest in sustainable technologies, mass transit, and other public infrastructure. We must rehabilitate schools and housing and establish healthcare for all. Impacted workers must be protected so they don't bear the social cost of this transition. They may require education, retraining, income guarantees, and relocation subsidies. A just transition will compensate impacted communities for lost tax revenues. We should democratize investment and ownership, creating employment investment trusts to develop sustainable family supporting jobs. And historically disadvantaged frontline and BIPOC communities must become a focus of investment and development, removing barriers to well-paid, skilled, and semi-skilled jobs. You know, when I talk to union members about this, I say we really have, as a labor movement, we have a choice. There's a train, and that train's leaving the station. We can be in the engine, helping to chart the route. We can be in the caboose, being dragged along by other people making the decisions. We can be left standing on the side at the station when the train pulls out, or we can end up being roadkill on the tracks. We've got to make a choice as a labor movement where we want to be in this process. What we know is we don't want workers to become roadkill. Choices have consequences. We can remain addicted to fossil fuels and militarism, or organize to create a just, decarbonized, demilitarized, and democratic, sustainable economy. It's a choice between cataclysm and a survivable future for future generations. The climatologist Michael Mann reminds us the cost of inaction far exceeds the cost of action. When he was interviewed by Paul J. John Cusack, the actor, observed, "You can't separate climate justice and militarism. The fight for environment is a fight for peace and justice, a fight for democracy, a fight for the right to live." There are two routes to species extinction: slowly as a consequence of climate change, or quickly as a consequence of nuclear holocaust. Both are human-made, and both are within our capacity as human beings to prevent. The actions we take or fail to take today will dictate whether our children, their children, and future generations will flourish or suffer. We've got to decide, what legacy will we leave them? What choices will we make? Recently, last month, East Bay Peace Action did a webinar on this same topic. And I didn't have time to review the entire thing, but I'm going to put a link to it in the chat after this program is over, so you can check it out yourself. And we're back to our intersections. Solidarity is not charity. It's a moral principle and a strategy for victory. I want to thank you for your attention. I know I went through these slides very quickly. I'm going to put a link in the chat so you can see the slideshow for yourself at your own pace. It's on a shared site. And of course, it'll be in the recording of this webinar. And now I'm happy to engage in answering any of your questions or in conversation.
Thank you so much, Michael. And I'm sorry that I forgot to say, invite people to put their questions into the chat. But I think I'll start out with a question that I have for you. And I encourage other people to put their questions in the chat, or if they prefer to raise their hand. But my question is, now that we're over the 20 years war that cost $21 trillion, when you add everything up, people say, oh no, it's not that big, but it is. It can be, I can, verify that. Do you think now that the administration and the powers that be are trying to stir up a war with China? I mean, what is your feeling about where they're going to look next to cause some conflicts that give us a chance to continue to build that military budget, which is ridiculously high? I just wonder what your feelings were about
Sure.
that.
Well, militarism requires a boogeyman. And, after the Second World War, we launched the Cold War and vilified the Soviet Union and then China. Then we had the War on Terror, and we vilified Muslims. And now that the War on Terror has been drawn to an official close, although I don't think it's ended, we need a new boogeyman. And that boogeyman is going to be China. It's the new punching bag. And it's going to be used to justify another cranking up of the military machine and military spending. Remember the concept of a peace dividend? We were supposed to have gotten a peace dividend at the end of the Cold War. And the military-industrial complex was desperate to find a way to prevent that from happening.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we got the global war on terror.
Yeah.
So you do think that they're gearing up for, it seems like the media is really helping them a lot.
Absolutely. Well, the media, as I indicated, is part of the military-industrial complex. It's the megaphone that speaks to us. That's how they speak to us, through the media. And they employ lots of lobbyists and public relations firms to amplify that message.
Okay,
Yeah, I have a
want to raise
question.
it? Okay, David has a question, and then Merle.
Yes, you made the observation, but certainly true, that the cost of inaction on climate change far exceeds the cost of action.
Yes.
But the problem is that action is needed up front, and the costs of inaction are more deferred. So how do we get the momentum going for
Right.
action when it's so easy just to say, well, we can deal with it next year or
Right.
5 years?
You know, it's like cleaning your garage or your basement. You keep putting it off, putting it off, putting it off, and then one day you end up facing a mess. The reality is that we don't have to do a whole lot. Nature is doing it for us. Nature is speaking to us. Nature is reminding us when it sends hurricanes to New Orleans and Florida or New York, when it shuts out the power grid in Texas, when it sets California and the Northwest on fire. Nature is sending us a message that you can't wait. We've got to deal with this now. Giving a good speech is not a substitute for taking action.
Thank you.
All right.
Ann Rovere had a question. Oh, did you want to reply to it? No. Ann Rovere had a question.
You said Merle had a question?
Yes, I did.
I'm sorry, Merle. Yes, you're right. Merle, you go first and then Ann.
Anyway, I was just remembering the peace dividend because we were so excited about the fact that that war in Vietnam was over. And the next thing I heard was that we were going to have to fight 3 wars at the same time.
Right.
And this is all before 9/11 happened. There were going to be 3 wars, and it was all predicted, including 9/11, was predicted that there would be something catastrophic happen that would require us to go to war. And they wanted to go to war in Iraq, but they went to Afghanistan first. And so it was Afghanistan, Iraq, and then was it Yemen? I mean, which was the 3rd war? And are we
No, we ended up in Libya and Syria.
Oh, that's right. So that's 4. So are we still on a track, or are we just going to take on China?
No, I mean, you can see that we also confront Russia. The Soviet Union's gone. So now Russia becomes their stand-in. And we rail against Russia, we rail against China, and we still have military in active combat in 7 or 8 countries. It's not clear how many because some of it is secret that we don't know about. But we have military still in Syria. We have military sitting on boats offshore from Libya. We send drones to attack people in Pakistan. So those wars aren't over. They're just being taken off the evening news. And the danger, of course, is that when you talk about a Cold War with Russia or China, that could easily become a hot war. And if it becomes a hot war, that means Holocaust. And then nobody wins.
Thank you.
See, I don't think they want a hot war. They want the threat of a hot war because that gives them the justification for putting more money into the military industrial budget.
Yeah.
Thank you. Ann Rovere has a question. She says, where do you find hope? And what do you recommend? Where would you put your efforts for like us, like in the Bay Area? They're very progressive. We try to vote correctly, but what else can we do besides just try to vote? You know,
Right. Well, I'm going to tell you, I find hope in the streets with the young people who are out there fighting. I find hope with them. They are the future. They're going to inherit whatever legacy we leave to them. So they have a stake in the outcome. And we have an obligation to be their allies in that battle. We have to take responsibility for the mess that was created on our watch, even if we individually are not responsible for making that mess. It's up to us to help clean it up as much as we can do before we leave and the next generation takes over. So that's where I find hope.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, Ann, did you have a reply to that?
No, that's helpful. Yeah. Streets.
You know,
I-
and given our age, we're not necessarily the people who are going to go sit in and get locked up and whatnot. But we certainly can show up at rallies. We can donate to those organizations like 350.org and Sunrise Movement. We can do political lobbying in support of their agenda. We can be writing to our members of Congress about the Green New Deal and demanding that they take action on the social, to shore up the social safety net. These are all things that we can do. We can do it from a wheelchair. We can do it from a bed.
Thank you, Michael. Those are real good suggestions. Let's see, Bob Birchfield had his hand up first. Bob, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, thank you for mentioning Smedley Butler. And quoting Smedley Butler is very much in tune with one of the perspectives of the military that I like to promote, which is basically that it's an institutionalized form of piracy. And along those lines, the lines of Smedley Butler realizing that he's a gangster, I think there's a lot of social problems that occur domestically with veterans who have been disillusioned. They've gone off to war young and idealistic, thinking that what they're doing is heroic, and then when they get into the battlefield, they find out that no, it's not heroic by any stretch of the imagination, and they're put in confrontations with civilians overseas and having to meet interesting people and kill them. And then they come home in a very spiritually broken condition, realizing that what they've done is commit atrocities rather than be heroes. So, do you have any observations on the state of the veterans these days?
Yeah,
and
actually, Dolores and I were talking about this just before we went on. And she reminded me that 4 times as many veterans die from suicide as were killed in combat in the wars on terror. 4 times as many. So in a sense, those wars are the wars that keep on giving. They keep on giving to the vets who come home with the scars, both physical and emotional, from their days in the military. Also, you'll notice if you read the reports about the insurrectionists and the right-wing militias, a disproportionate number of those folks are in the military and the cops, the police. That's their background. And they bring that militarized authoritarian mentality to this political movement of reactionaries and proto-fascists.
Thank you. Okay, Larry, Larry has a question.
Yes. So I thoroughly agree with you about the military being the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases.
Could you speak a little closer to your microphone, Larry? I'm having trouble hearing you.
Yeah, I have a little bit of trouble with my mic. It sometimes starts out very low and then comes into.
Okay, well, just speak up. I can hear you fine.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So I agree with you about the military being the greatest emitter of greenhouse gases globally, and but during I guess it was during the Trump administration, they kind of made it known that they were experimenting with aircraft that are battery and solar operated, or alternative fuels. And then also about some sort of fleet, maybe fleet trucks and fleet vehicles, kind of battery operated vehicles, to kind of put, maybe this was all window dressing because they were coming under criticism. Do you have any later information on that?
Well, you'll notice in the infrastructure bill, they put billions of dollars that go to the Pentagon for research on exactly that. New technologies that they can use to help the military continue to fight. And it becomes the justification for raising more funds for the military, that they end up with a bigger budget, because now they've got to build, they have to design and build a whole new generation of weapons that account for the changes in the environment that are taking place. And as the military says, they see the climate crisis as a threat multiplier, meaning it amplifies any threat that exists out there. So this becomes their opportunity to shake down the American public.
Okay, thank you for that.
We have another question getting back to China from Jim. You indicate that the media was part of the military-industrial complex. So with regard to China, what exactly has the media reported that is not true?
Well, the media serves as an echo chamber for the State Department, basically, and for the military. I mean, how many times have you tuned into the evening news and the commentator, the specialist who comes on board, is a retired general? They don't even make a pretense of hiding what they're doing. I've got a dog in my lap. Excuse me. He wants to be part of the show. So the media is part of the problem, not part of the solution.
Yeah.
There are limited numbers of good media, that try to honestly report what goes on, but they don't have the kind of resources that the big corporations put into this.
And could you mention what statement specifically that China's doing that's dangerous?
Well, for example, they automatically assume that every action that China takes is a military threat that requires a military response. So now, for example, they're sending the fleet to the China seas, operating our fleet offshore of China. If that's not a provocation, what is? They ramp up the propaganda machine and threaten China. And when China responds, they declare China to be the enemy.
Yeah, I don't understand how they focus on China doing things off their own shores, because
Right.
it just seems ridiculous that they don't even, with the question Taiwan, and they don't look at
what we, here's a good example. Taiwan. Taiwan was part of China. It became a separate so-called republic when Chiang Kai-shek, the reactionary general, fled the mainland when the Chinese communists took over. China has a legitimate claim to Taiwan. Now, should they be using, confrontational techniques to enforce that claim? No, they shouldn't. It should be diplomatic and political. But the hypocrisy of the way we have treated Cuba, an island off our shores that wasn't ever part of the United States, but we treat it as if it's automatically and legitimately part of our sphere of influence. It shows the hypocrisy.
Yeah, it would be good to have some of those examples. We heard from Roger Underhill that says it stated that the Build Back Better bill would address some of the problems for ordinary people, but overcoming Joe Manchin blocking along with the filibuster need to be ended as a problem right now. So I guess we don't, I think people feel helpless because they can't, they're not in,
Right.
they can just watch the play back and forth and it's just so depressing, because we
Well,
can't do anything about
there are
it.
some things that we can do. We don't live in West Virginia, but we have relatives who live in the East. And we can be writing to them and urging them to contact their members of Congress. We don't have a problem here with Barbara Lee or even with Nancy Pelosi, other than the fact that she's tied totally to the corporations. But it's the corporate influence on our Congress that keeps from overturning the filibuster. The filibuster is in service to the right wing of the Democratic Party as much as to the Republican Party. And that's how Joe Manchin gets to throw his weight around.
Yeah. Oh, those are some good suggestions. Art Persico says, is the Vermont State Labor Council doing anything that could be a model that you would endorse in regard to opposing militarism and protecting the environment, and that the rest of the labor movement could replicate? If so,
Good point. The Vermont State Labor Council, which is like the California Federation of Labor, it's the statewide federation of all the unions in Vermont. It's part of the AFL-CIO, but it has an independent voice, and it's used that voice to stand up to some of these policies. And the result is that the AFL-CIO has now issued a gag rule applicable to all labor councils that says they are not allowed to speak publicly about foreign policy that is in conflict with the position of the AFL-CIO. Now, if we had had that in effect here, our labor council in Alameda County would never have taken a position against the war in Vietnam, apartheid in South Africa, the war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the war on terror, any number of these things that we stood up and spoke out against, that the AFL-CIO either was on the wrong side or was silent. And so my personal view is that we have to ignore that rule. And if they want to put our councils in receivership, we should say, okay, we're going to stop paying dues to you. That's a form of strike. That's the one economic power we have and influence in the AFL-CIO. The AFL-CIO is losing members by the year. It should put its energy into building and organizing new unions, not in throttling the unions that they have when they show some independence.
No, that's very sad.
Good point.
Here's another question. From Anne Rovere, what are your thoughts about Russia taking the Crimea?
Well, there again, the Crimea was part of the Soviet Union. Russia has historical relationships, and a very substantial portion of the Crimean population are ethnic Russians. So it's not so simple to say Russia has no business. What in fact is the problem is that Russia feels threatened by NATO, which operates on its borders, setting up missiles pointed at Moscow and at various other sites in Russia that we would never allow Russia to do to us. The Cuban Missile Crisis existed because Russia had the audacity to put missiles in Cuba. But we do the same thing in Poland.
Yeah.
In Hungary. In Germany, we are encircling
Hi.
Russia and China with bases. If you look at a map of where our bases are, they circle these countries. Now, if a gang of thugs showed up outside your house, armed to the teeth, chanting threats and threatening to attack, what would your response be?
Yep. I have another question. You know, the New York Times is, well, we get the New York Times every day, but their graphs are so beautiful. And, you know, they've had so many graphs about COVID and so on. Why? I have never seen a graph like the one you put up about where our bases are all over the country. And I mean, that kind of information is just withheld from the American people. Is that, I suppose, I sound kind of naive, I guess, but is that on purpose? Because
Well, you're making my point. The media is part of the problem, not the solution. They are tied into the military industrial complex. They have a vested interest in perpetuating the status quo. And
Yeah.
even the media that, you know, you can say the liberal media, like the New York Times is supposed to be liberal. It's not really liberal, it's just corporate. But even those elements of the media are unwilling to stand up against the military industrial complex.
Yeah, I wish there were, I don't know if you can write to them and say, why don't you publish this and enclose, you
Well,
know.
I can tell you one thing you can do: cancel your subscription.
Oh, no, we don't want to do that.
Read it online or something. Or, you know,
Yeah.
I don't have a subscription, and they block you online when you go to their website unless you have a subscription. But if you take the headline of their stories and put it into a search, Google search, you often will find the same story published in full in other publications. And that's how I read the New York Times.
Uh-huh.
Interesting.
Those are good. Okay, Art has another statement on a slightly different but related topic I know you care about, and we all should. What role should the labor movement, which can lead the rest of us, do about the impending fascist government that will further erode democracy if it gets majorities in this country in the 2022 midterm elections? This highlights the importance of not allowing the national AFL-CIO to muzzle local labor councils across the country. That's a very good question, I think.
Yeah. Well, you should know, and probably don't, that prior to the inauguration, when there was a real serious threat of a coup, unions around the country began to network with one another. And we said, if they seize power, we're going to declare a general strike. And we let the AFL-CIO know that we were not going to stand for the kind of subversion of democracy, what little democracy we have, even if it's in name only, and allow the fascist right to seize power in this country. So my answer is, we respond to the threat, and we need to escalate our response as the threat escalates.
Very good. Roger Underhill has another question. He says the United States broke a promise to Russia that we wouldn't expand NATO, and they did, but I guess no repercussions from that, or?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why Russia acts the way it does. You know, we consider China, Russia, Cuba, Venezuela to be unreliable diplomatic partners, that we can't trust them. But it was the United States that signed an agreement and then pulled out of the nuclear treaty with Iran. or not treaty, the agreement with Iran. It was the United States that made a declaration and then pulled out of the climate conference on parties.
Mhm.
Who's the unreliable party here? And you know, even in Europe, where our so-called allies, they question, can they depend on anything that Biden says that won't be overturned by the next president?
Okay, I think we had another question from Roger. Roger, did you have a question? Roger Underhill? You had your hand up there, I
It's
think.
muted.
I can't unmute.
No, that was just a thumbs up for what he was saying.
Oh,
Well,
Thank you.
if I may, you know, the Conference of Parties number 26 just ended in Glasgow. And Michael Mann, who I referred to earlier, did an interview where he kind of summarized his view of what happened in that conference. And it's about 4 minutes long. And if you will indulge me, I'll play it for you.
oh, great, yeah.
Let me
No more
see.
questions right now, but yeah, we'd love
Get
to
the
hear
screen
it.
share going again.
Fancy phone.
There has been some real progress. If you look at the pledges that have been made now, including pledges that have been updated during the conference itself, we now have commitments, pledges from the countries of the world that are likely to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius. That's a huge improvement from where we were headed, closer to 4 degrees Celsius before this latest round of negotiations and these renewed commitments came into being. So we've made some real progress, but that's not good enough. We've got to get warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. We've got to get on a path that keeps warming below those levels if we are to avert the worst impacts of climate change. And so there's quite a bit of work left to be done. And let's also recognize that it's one thing to pledge a certain reduction in carbon emissions. It's something else to actually make good on that pledge. And so while we're hearing politicians talk the talk, we've got to make sure they walk the walk.
Yeah, so just to be absolutely clear, those kind of big ticket pledges we heard about last week, so we've got deforestation, the pledges on methane, there were pledges on finance too. You don't think that that is enough in order to help achieve the target of keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees? You don't think they've done enough yet?
No, they certainly haven't. And as you say, there's been some progress when it comes to deforestation, which is a major contributor to carbon emissions, methane, which is an even more potent greenhouse gas on short time scales. On longer time scales, it's really the carbon dioxide that dominates. And most of that is coming from the burning of fossil fuels. So no agreement that really has teeth in it can avoid substantial commitments to reducing carbon emissions. Carbon dioxide emissions. And that means, for example, that we've got to see the US, the UK, the EU, Australia, and others commit to no new fossil fuel infrastructure. The International Energy Agency has told us that there can be no new fossil fuel infrastructure built if we are to avert that dangerous 1.5 degrees Celsius target.
I don't know if you will be aware of the Campbell oil field. That's causing some controversy here in the UK. That is expected to go on stream west of Shetland, and you know it has been kind of a thorn in the side for many politicians over here. And the argument would be that actually we do need to keep drilling for oil here in the medium to long term, because if not, then we're going to have to import it, and that won't be as climate friendly. What do you make of that argument?
Yeah, so that doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. There is quite a bit of potential actually in the UK for expanding renewable energy, and there are enough other sources of renewable energy, that you can import it if necessary. And in the end, it's still not as expensive as fossil fuels, because the burning of fossil fuels not only impacts air quality, there's a real health care costs with the air pollution associated with fossil fuel extraction and burning, but it's creating catastrophic climate change impacts. If you look at the devastating droughts and heat waves and floods that the UK has endured in recent years, if you were to total that up, you would very quickly see that the cost of climate inaction to the UK, to Scotland, to England, to the rest of the world is far greater than the cost of taking action.
So that's Michael Mann. Just two short additional points, and then maybe we can close this out. He made reference to no new drilling. And we've heard our governor and our president pontificate about the climate crisis. But Jerry Brown this last year signed permits for 138 new oil drilling projects in California.
You mean Newsom, right?
Newsom, excuse me. Yes, Newsom. And the president is issuing permits to the oil companies for more exploration and drilling. So the hypocrisy involved here, and when Mann talks about talk the talk and walk the walk, well, it's time to walk the walk and stop listening to the talk. Greta Thunberg made it very easy. Blah, blah, blah. She talks about the blah, blah, blah of the politicians. We have to say no more blah, blah, blah. We want action. I want to thank you for your patience and indulgence. I'm going to put in the chat a link to that webinar from Peace Action I referred to earlier.
Michael, and the other thing is, I was just going to ask you about Newsom's approving those the oil drilling. Is there any group that we could go to join? Because that to me is just horrible. He's such a phony, and that we could, really raise hell about that.
Yes. There almost every major environmental group in California is involved in leaning on Newsom. 350.org would be a good one. The Sierra Club would be another.
Yeah.
David has a question.
Yeah, there's another aspect of the cost of transition that's been getting quite a bit of press, and that is the need to help poorer individuals and poorer countries deal with the costs of transition that they can't afford. Already there have been strikes in Europe in France because they tried to raise taxes on gasoline, and ordinary working people just can't afford it. India apparently, I just heard this morning, wants $1 trillion to help its transition. I think in the Paris Agreement of 2015, the wealthier countries were supposed to come up with $100 billion a year to help the poor countries, but they haven't come through yet. So could you speak to this need to help poor individuals and poorer countries?
Yeah, let's start with the thing you ended with. Not only didn't they not come through with the money, all the money they did come through with was given as loans, encumbering these countries that already are poor with an obligation to pay back. And what the countries are saying in the developing world is not only should you be giving us grants, but you owe us reparations for the damages you have done already.
Yes.
And I think the same can be said about poor people in this country. It's the frontline communities, mostly people of color, who bear the biggest burden of pollution and environmental degradation.
Right.
And instead of encumbering them with taxes and loans, we should be issuing grants to their communities to compensate for the damage that has been done. And that can become in the form of a tax on corporate revenue, on the oil corporations' profits. They should be paying for the damage they've done.
Okay, Michael.
Not easy politically.
No. I think we'll close in just a minute. I think there's one more question from Bob Birchfield, and then we'll close. But do you have a newsletter or something that you send out that people can?
Yes. Well, thank you for inviting me to put that in. I have something called Solidarity Info Service and a website, solidarityinfoservice.org, where I put memes, political memes that I create every week. And I have a newsletter that comes out twice a week that provides links to articles about the things we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to put in the chat a link to the subscription form for those of you who would like to receive it. There's no charge. I accept donations gratefully, but it's not required.
Is it this one called Webinar Racism Militarism? Is that it?
I'm sorry?
Is it the one?
No. That's the East Bay Peace Action webinar. The one I referred to earlier. So let me put this.
Okay, and then in the meantime, Bob, do you want to? Yeah, you have one last question, Bob?
Yeah, sure. I didn't have a question. I just wanted to make a little comment about Gavin Newsom, that he showed his loyalty to the oil industry by recently attending the wedding of an oil heiress, one of the Getty family members, and along with London Breed, which is just it shows his devotion to the plutocrats and
Right.
to the oil industry itself.
That was his second Let Them Eat Cake event. And the earlier one was going to this fancy restaurant when he's telling everybody else to stay home.
Yeah, right.
And spending hundreds of dollars on a meal.
Yeah,
with his rich friends.
Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Michael. And this this video will be available soon online on our UUSF.org line. Is that right, Michael? I mean, Jim? UUSF.org, Humanists Non-Theists. It'll be shown. It'll be converted to a video.
Well, it's been a great pleasure, and I'll see you in the streets.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Hi, Julie.
Bye, everybody.
Thank